Hello, this is George Vikich, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on the water cycle. So the water cycle is extremely important to geology because pretty much every aspect of geology is somehow related to the water cycle, right? Volcanic eruptions related to the water cycle. You know, reservoirs that we learned about recently, important to the water cycle. Groundwater and stuff like that, obviously important to the water cycle. Oceans, we learned a lot about oceans. That's related to the water cycle. We learned a lot about biology and how plants and animals and stuff relate to the kind of macro ecosystem and how that relates to geology, and that is also related to the water cycle. So literally every aspect of geology is somehow related to the water cycle, making this a very central thing to understand in order to understand Earth. So the vast majority of the Earth's water is in the ocean, as you can see from this somewhat more detailed version of the last infographic, basically. The last one was pretty much just kind of a picture. This is more of an infographic, and we can see that the vast majority of the Earth's water is in the ocean, but there also is water everywhere else, right? You go to a saline lake, there's water. You go to a fresh lake, there's water. Rivers, there's water. Soil, there's water. There's water literally everywhere, which is why what I was talking about earlier, where everything in geology is somehow related to the water cycle. But the vast majority of the water is in the ocean. So the question is, where else besides the ocean is it? The ocean obviously has non-fresh water, but 2.5% of this water is fresh water. And most of that is in glaciers and ice caps, as well as in groundwater, which we learned about glaciers and ice caps earlier, and we learned about groundwater earlier. So clearly, related to all of geology. But probably the most interesting part to humans is the surface water / other fresh water, which is only 1.2% of fresh water. And a lot of that is in ice and permafrost, as well as there's a decent amount in lakes, which, here in Wisconsin, we have lots of lakes. So obviously, we're going to have lots of fresh water. So glaciers are an important part of the water cycle, and basically glaciers are water that ends up getting frozen and kind of stays frozen regardless of the season because of the geographic location. So a lot of water in the water cycle ends up, freezing, melting, whereas glaciers are permanently frozen. And so this makes them particularly interesting as basically almost like above ground reservoirs in terms of how they function in the water cycle. Rainforests are also very important to the water cycle. Rainforests have massive trees which suck up water and then kind of disperse the water, obviously, when they kind of breathe, I guess you could say, is kind of what trees do metaphorically. So, in the Amazon, they suck up very massive amounts of water and let it out, and all sorts of rainforests do this. Humans can have kind of a negative impact on the water cycle. I actually found a scientific paper. This is very important to look at this data. We can see all sorts of river systems, especially those in Asia. If you look at the Tigris or Euphrates or the Indus, you see especially the rivers in Asia are being really drained by humans' negative impact on the water cycle. But not all human influence on the water cycle is bad. If you look at water for domestic use is oftentimes cleaned before it's let back into kind of ecosystem, but industrial use, not so much. So that's probably part of why Asia is having a negative influence on its river systems from humans influencing the water cycle, because there's a lot of industrial stuff going on there. And here are my sources. And that was a water cycle, something very important to understand as far as relating to all of the rest of geology.